For part 2 of chapter 2 material, we'll start by discussing the structural organization of the nervous system as well as the functional organization of the nervous system. And then we'll talk about specific brain regions that are of interest and will be important throughout the remainder of the semester. Structurally, the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord, which comprises that central axis of the human body, whereas the peripheral nervous system includes the nerves, which are bundles of nerve processes or axons that extend off of the brain and the spinal cord, as well as the ganglia, which are clusters of neuronal cell bodies located along the nerves. Functionally, the nervous system is divided into sensory and motor pathways. Sensory pathways are afferent pathways and make up the input pathways. The sensory nervous system detects stimuli and transmits information from sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Whereas the motor nervous system is the output system. This system initiates and transmits information from the central nervous system to effectors, essentially executing commands after integrating sensory information in the brain and the spinal cord. These two can be further divided. The sensory nervous system is further divided into somatic sensory and visceral sensory components. Somatic sensory input is input that is consciously perceived from receptors. You can think of receptors in the eyes that are detecting changes in light or wavelengths of light. Receptors in the ear for detecting sound or balance. Receptors in the skin that detect changes in temperature or pressure. Whereas the visceral sensory input is input that is not consciously perceived and comes from receptors in areas like blood vessels and internal organs like the heart. These receptors detect changes in homeostatic mechanisms, for instance in blood pressure, and send that information to the central nervous system so that any changes that are unnecessary can be corrected. The motor nervous system is divided into the somatic motor component and the autonomic motor component. The somatic motor component is the motor output that is consciously or voluntarily controlled. In this case, the effector is skeletal muscle. So there are motor neurons that act to innervate skeletal muscle by releasing a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And these neurons are under our conscious or voluntary control. The autonomic motor component is motor output that is not consciously or is involuntarily controlled. In this case, the effectors are cardiac muscle of the heart, smooth muscle, such as is found around blood vessels or around the layers of the GI tract, as well as glands. So again, this is motor output that we are not consciously in control of. For an overview of brain anatomy, the brain is made up of 4 major regions. The cerebrum, which consists of 2 hemispheres and 5 lobes per hemisphere. The diencephalon, which includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The brain stem, which includes areas like the pons and the medulla. And lastly, the cerebellum. As you can see, the outer surface of the cerebrum here is folded, and these folds are significant in the function of the brain. So these outer, larger folds are known collectively as the gyri or singular gyrus, whereas the inner folds are known as sulci or a singular sulcus. So this design of all of these folds of the cerebral cortex allows for greater surface area and allows for more neurons to be accommodated within the brain areas. A mid-sagittal view of the brain demonstrates, a couple of other landmarks that are important to know. One being this area of white matter tracts known as the corpus callosum. So this corpus callosum will be what connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. Also seen in this view very clearly is the cerebellum, which is important in the maintenance of balance and posture. Also the pons and the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. So we'll go over specific functions of these areas in greater detail as we go through the lecture. Also note the differences between gray matter, which you can see mostly on the outside layers of the cerebral cortex, and the inner white matter. The difference between these two is really the presence of myelin surrounding axons within the white matter. That high lipid content that stems from oligodendrocyte cells is what allows for rapid action potential propagation down the length of the axons, and what gives this tissue its white appearance. So these areas of white matter are mostly axonal tracts, whereas the outer areas of gray matter mostly consist of neuronal cell bodies. So the brain must be highly protected, and there are several mechanisms and features in place to allow for full protection of the brain. Two of the main features that allow for protection of the brain include the outer layers or the meninges, as well as the inner cavities known as the ventricles, which contain cerebrospinal fluid. The cranial meninges consist of 3 connective tissue layers that are each separate and support the underlying soft tissue of the brain. As you can see in this image, from deep to most superficial is the pia mater, the arachnoid matter, and the dura mater layer. So again, these layers help to protect the brain. They allow for spaces for blood vessels to provide nutrients to the brain tissue, and they also help in the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, which is formed in the ventricles or the cavities within the brain. Remember, we talked about supportive cells in the prior lecture. One type of supportive cell is the ependymal cell, and that cell lines these cavities or ventricles within the brain and helps in forming cerebrospinal fluid. So this image depicts those ventricles or cavities of the brain, all seen here in blue. You have the 2 lateral ventricles, the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle. These ventricles are very important in allowing for the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid, which again is produced in part by the ependymal supportive cells. Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colorless liquid surrounding the central nervous system, so surrounding both the brain and the spinal cord. And as I mentioned, it circulates in the ventricles as well as the subarachnoid space, or the space between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater meninge layers. This liquid is very important in providing buoyancy and reduces the brain's apparent weight by 95%. So the brain on average weighs about 3 pounds. In order to hold the head up high and maintain posture while holding that brain in the head, this cerebrospinal fluid allows for the brain to essentially be weightless, floating in cerebrospinal fluid within the cranium or the skull. It also protects the cerebrospinal fluid by providing a liquid cushion, and importantly, it keeps the environment of the the central nervous system stable by transporting nutrients and wastes, and helping in protect against chemical fluctuations by maintaining the proper electrolyte balance. Here's another image of the two lateral ventricles, where you can see what's called choroid plexus in areas of the ventricles, which are blood vessels that also contribute to the formation of cerebrospinal fluid, along with those ependymal cells that line the cavities. Cerebrospinal fluid is constantly circulating, it's constantly formed and reabsorbed, and it follows this pathway from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and then surrounding the brain and back into the lateral ventricles. Again, this is a mid-sagittal view, meaning that the brain is essentially sliced in half, separating the left and right hemispheres, allowing for us to see an inner view of the brain at the midline. Another form of protection comes from the blood-brain barrier. This is very important in regulating which substances enter the brain's interstitial fluid and helps prevent neuronal exposure to harmful substances. I've mentioned before that certain drugs have to be high in lipid content in order to enter into brain tissue. That goes the same for wastes, abnormal solute concentrations as well. Some drugs can pass and affect the brain, an example being alcohol. As mentioned previously, an important supportive cell in forming the blood-brain barrier is the astrocyte, which is pictured here with the perivascular feet surrounding blood vessels, and again controlling very precisely what is able to enter and exit the bloodstream. Now let's start getting into specific brain regions, and we'll begin with the cerebrum, the largest in anatomy of all of the brain regions. The cerebrum is the origin of all complex intellectual functions. Remember, there are two large hemispheres of the cerebrum, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, on the superior aspect of the brain. Again, as this is the origin of all complex intellectual functions, it's the center of intelligence and reasoning, thought, memory, and judgment, as well as voluntary motor, visual, and auditory activities. This image here shows how each area of the cerebrum is important for a different function, although of course several regions will work together in integrating their neuronal pathways in order to form an executive command or receive incoming sensory input. So examples to point out here include, in orange, you have the primary somatosensory cortex, and on the other side of that, what we call the dividing line, the central sulcus, is the primary motor cortex. Again, the cerebrum is made up of 5 lobes: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the insula within. The frontal lobe has varied functions. It's important in many aspects of cognitive control, including concentration, verbal communication, decision-making, planning, and personality, as well as motor control. As I mentioned, the primary motor cortex is important in all motor control that is voluntary. The parietal lobe serves general sensory functions, in example, evaluating the shape and texture of objects. The temporal lobe is sensory in function as well, and includes hearing and smell functions. The occipital lobe is important in vision and visual memories. And lastly, the insula, which is not as well established in studies, is known to function in memory and the sense of taste. Here's another look at the cerebral hemispheres, where you can see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, and the occipital lobes. Functional areas of the cerebrum include, as mentioned previously, motor areas as well as sensory areas. The primary motor cortex, also called the somatic motor area, controls voluntary movements, that is, skeletal muscle activity on the opposite side of the body. So neurons project contralaterally to the opposite side within the brainstem or the spinal cord. An example, primary motor neurons from the left hemisphere cross over to control the right side of the body. The controlled body regions map as a motor homunculus. This term is used to demonstrate the distorted proportions of the body, which reflect the amount of cortex dedicated to each part. For example, as seen here, this area that's controlling hand movements is quite large in comparison to other regions. This is because of the very precise movements that are required by our hands overall. Other motor areas include the motor speech area, or Broca's area, which is important for speech production, the frontal eye field, and the premotor cortex. Sensory areas include the primary somatosensory cortex and the somatosensory association area. The primary somatosensory cortex also is mapped as a sensory homunculus. As you can see, again, large areas dedicated to sensory information perceived from the hands, as well as the mouth and tongue. The somatosensory association area is important for integrating touch information, allowing us to identify objects by feel. Additional sensory areas include the primary visual cortex, the visual association area, which integrates information on color, form, and memory, and allows us to identify things that we see, the primary auditory cortex, the auditory association area, which interprets sounds and stores and retrieves memories of sounds, the primary olfactory cortex, which provides a conscious awareness of smells, and the primary gustatory cortex, which is involved in processing taste information. Other functional brain areas include the prefrontal cortex, important in complex thought, judgment, personality, planning, and deciding, Wernicke's area, which is important in speech comprehension, and the Gnostic area, which is important in sensory information, whereas sights, smells, and sounds converge and the brain becomes aware of a situation. This image demonstrates again the lobes of the brain and their functional areas. A closer look demonstrates the location of the motor speech area or Broca's area, the primary motor cortex, and the premotor cortex. Also shown here is Wernicke's area for speech comprehension, the prefrontal cortex, and the Gnostic area. Cerebral lateralization is a topic that we will cover in depth in the chapter of hemispheric specialization. For the most part, the two sides of the cerebrum exhibit differences in higher order functions. The categorical hemisphere is usually the left hemisphere, which is specialized for language abilities and functions in categorization and analysis. This is where Broca's speech motor area is, as well as Wernicke's speech comprehension area. The right hemisphere is typically the representational hemisphere, and this is more so concerned with visuospatial relationships, imagination, and comparison of the senses. The two hemispheres communicate through those white matter tracts that make up the corpus callosum, as well as several other commissures or pathways of white matter tracts. I want to mention the cerebral nuclei, which are groups of cell bodies that are deep in the cerebrum and make up the gray matter portions that we see deeper in the cerebrum. These are mostly responsible for regulating motor output, and diseases of these nuclei are associated with involuntary movements. Other areas to point out here include the amygdaloid body, which is an important component of the limbic system and mediates the fear response. Next, we'll move to the diencephalon, which includes the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The diencephalon provides relays and switching centers for sensory, motor, and visceral pathways. The epithalamus contains the pineal gland, which is an endocrine gland that secretes melatonin and helps regulate day-night cycles or the circadian rhythm. The thalamus is known as the relay center. It is composed of about a dozen thalamic nuclei, and axons from a given nucleus project to a particular region of cortex. The thalamus receives signals from all conscious senses with the exception of olfaction. Again, it's known as the relay center, which means that it relays signals to the appropriate part of the cortex and filters out other signals distracting from the subject of attention. For example, filtering out background noise in a crowded room. The hypothalamus is an important region in the control of the autonomic nervous system. It influences heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and respiration. It's also important in the control of the endocrine system. It secretes hormones that control activities in the anterior pituitary gland and produces antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. It's important in the regulation of body temperature, as well as emotional behavior, food intake, water intake, and sleep-wake rhythms. The hypothalamus is mainly known as a region that's important in maintaining homeostasis within the body at any level. Again, controlling body temperature, having an influence on heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, etc. Next is the brain stem. The brain stem connects the cerebrum, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum to the spinal cord. It contains ascending and descending tracts, meaning both sensory and motor tracts, and contains autonomic nuclei of cranial nerves, and reflex centers. It consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain has a number of different regions, including the cerebral peduncles, the medial lemniscus, and the substantia nigra. Also the tegmentum, the cerebral aqueduct, and the tectum. The tectum is important in controlling visual reflexes and tracking, as well as controlling auditory reflexes. The pons is the bulging region on the anterior brain stem. It includes sensory and motor tracts connecting the brain to the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata is on the caudal portion of the brainstem and connects to the spinal cord. It includes sensory and motor tracts connecting the brain to the spinal cord, and it is important in controlling cardiovascular and respiratory vital centers. Lastly is the cerebellum. The cerebellum coordinates and fine-tunes movements. It ensures that muscle activity follows a correct pattern and stores memories of previously learned movements. It adjusts movements initiated by the cerebrum, ensuring smoothness. What's important to remember about the cerebrum is that it helps maintain equilibrium and posture. It receives information from receptors called proprioceptors in the muscles and joints in order to maintain that balance. It continuously receives motor plans and sensory feedback. And here's a midsection of the cerebrum and the cerebrum in full. As you can see, the cerebrum has many pathways that extend to it and from it. Again, mostly important in maintaining that posture and balance. We'll finish up with discussing the limbic system, or the emotional brain. The limbic system is composed of multiple cerebral and diencephalic structures that process and experience emotions. There are interconnected components which include the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, the amygdaloid body, as well as olfactory bulbs, tracts, and cortex. Again, this region, which you can see all of the regions in purple, are interconnected in order to control emotions in certain aspects. For example, the hippocampus is mainly important in memory formation and retrieval, whereas the amygdala is important in the fear response. These two work together to allow for the memory of particular fears to be maintained.